Let's set the stakes. Nvidia is still the toll booth on the AI highway, roughly 80–90% share of data center AI accelerators by most estimates. So when Meta and Google talk about aligning on open chip standards and potentially co-investing in custom silicon, that's not just vendor diversification, it's an attempt to weaken that toll booth. But even if they succeed technically, we're already seeing the next wall: power and space. Meta's own filings project data center power demand doubling this decade. So is this really post-Nvidia or just pre-grid crunch AI?
The grid crunch is real, but we can't ignore the immediate financial logic driving this. Nvidia is currently extracting roughly 76% gross margins. That's a massive tax on the entire AI supply chain. By aligning on standards, Meta and Google are effectively creating a buyer's cartel to commoditize the compute layer. They aren't just trying to replace H100s, they need to reclaim those margin dollars specifically to fund the physical infrastructure, the copper, liquid cooling, and power capacity. This pact shifts bargaining power so they can actually afford the next massive capex cycle.
That margin recapture is logical, but the real constraint isn't just dollars, it's megawatts. Even with cheaper chips, Meta's own SEC filings project their AI data center power use will double by 2028. The limiting factor isn't who makes the silicon, but whether utilities can deliver enough power and cooling. According to EPRI, data center electricity demand could hit 9% of total U.S. load by 2030. So, unless we solve for grid upgrades and thermal management, chip swaps just move the bottleneck down the pipe.
Power and margins are real constraints, but I'm skeptical about timelines for actual vendor switching. As someone running mixed GPU/TPU fleets, the interoperability pain is brutal. Meta and Google would need to rewrite training frameworks, retune models, and retool entire MLOps stacks. That's a 12 to 18-month transition minimum per workload. The pact is probably leveraged to negotiate better Nvidia terms rather than true diversification. As my recent capacity planning showed, even if we solved chip costs tomorrow, we'd still hit thermal throttling at 150 kilowatts per rack. Power density, not silicon, will be our breaking point before any vendor switch matters.
All three of you are circling the same triangle: margins, megawatts, and migration pain. Let me press on the post-Nvidia part with a concrete contrast. Google's TPU program is nearly a decade old, yet by most analyst counts, Nvidia still holds 80–90% of data center accelerator share. That suggests custom silicon alone doesn't dethrone the incumbent. So what would have to be different this time? Is it the scale of a Meta-Google alliance, the emergence of open interconnects like UALink, or a genuine willingness to standardize software stacks, even if that dilutes each company's proprietary edge?
The difference is the shift from proprietary islands to an open ecosystem. Previously, TPUs were internal tools. Now, the catalyst is the UALink promoter group, which notably excludes NVIDIA. By standardizing scale-up interconnects to rival NVLink's proprietary speeds, Meta and Google are finally building the roads for a multi-vendor reality. As an investor, I view this as the inevitable horizontalization of the stack. It creates a plug-and-play market that commoditizes the hardware, effectively lowering the barrier for challengers like AMD or Broadcom to finally gain share and break the CUDA lock-in.
It's an important shift, but let's keep perspective. Even with open interconnects like ULink, the physics don't change. The power density at the rack level is already hitting limits. Uptime Institute reports 48% of operators see power supply as their #1 constraint for AI expansion. Whether it's NVIDIA or a dozen plug-and-play vendors, if you can't deliver and cool 100+ kilowatts per rack, none of this scales. So while horizontalization may erode NVIDIA's margins, the real bottleneck, electricity and thermal management, remains stubbornly vertical, dictated by local grid realities.
UALink is a necessary road, but we've been driving on dirt paths for years. In my fleet work, even open standards create new failure modes, coherency bugs, protocol incompatibilities, vendor-specific performance cliffs. Guest B is right on the physics, but I'm more concerned about the software layer, PyTorch/XLA fragmentation, NCCL behavior across vendors, custom kernel stacks. The horizontalization story ignores that MLOps tooling maturity, not interconnect specs, determines whether you can actually swap chips without 6 months of regression testing. Until the software ecosystem matures, UA-Link just gives us prettier dirt roads while we hit the same thermal walls.
Both of you are basically saying, even if UA-Link cracks NVIDIA's moat, we're still stuck in the mud, either at the grid or in the software stack. Let me add a third constraint, geography. Dominion Energy has already warned Northern Virginia, the world's biggest data center hub, that new large connections may face multi-year delays. If the prime regions are power constrained and the tooling for multi-vendor fleets is immature, does a Meta-Google pact actually accelerate AI or just redistribute who gets the scarce best-located megawatts? And who loses, smaller clouds or non-AI workloads, when that triage happens?
The grid constraints actually validate the custom silicon thesis. When Northern Virginia is capped, the metric shifts from cost per chip to yield per megawatt. Google claims their latest Trillium TPU is over 67% more energy efficient than the previous generation. That efficiency is the only lever left to bypass infrastructure delays. The pact accelerates this by standardizing dense, optimized rack designs that merchant silicon can't match. The real losers are Tier 2 clouds. They're stuck renting power-hungry H100s, effectively priced out of the grid, while the hyperscalers use custom IP to decouple their growth from local utility limits.
I get the efficiency argument, but let's not confuse incremental gains with solving the bottleneck. Even if Trillium TPUs are 67% more efficient, rack-level power densities are still up against the same substation and cooling constraints. The grid doesn't flex because a chip is slightly leaner. In fact, hyperscalers may simply pack more compute into the same footprint, compounding local stress. Uptime's latest survey notes that median rack densities are already up 60% year over year. So the Meta-Google pact might just reallocate scarce megawatts to the biggest players, leaving everyone else squeezed even harder.
Both Guest A and Guest B highlight important truths, but they converge on a single constraint, the grid. Even if Trillium's 67% efficiency is real, Uptime's 2024 data shows median rack power density jumped 60% year over year, meaning more chips per megawatt, not fewer. And in my fleet, the software stack is still brittle. PyTorch/XLA and NCCL diverge across vendors, forcing months of regression testing before we can actually swap silicon. So while UA-Link lowers the interconnect barrier, the real bottleneck remains power and tooling maturity. The pact may shift who gets the scarce megawatt, but it won't magically create capacity.
So we've got a consensus that the grid and the software stack are the hard walls, and efficiency mostly lets hyperscalers hoard more compute per substation. Let me push this forward. Does that mean the Meta-Google pact is really about bargaining power, not capacity? If two of the biggest buyers can show a credible, ULink-compatible alternative, they can squeeze NVIDIA on price while still reserving the choicest megawatts in Northern Virginia, Oregon, Ireland. Meanwhile, Synergy Research says hyperscalers already account for over half of global data center capacity. So is this deal just deepening that asymmetry rather than ushering in a post-Nvidia era?
The asymmetry is the whole point. You have to remember, 4 major players account for roughly 40% of NVIDIA's revenue. If Meta and Google align on UL-Link, they aren't just negotiating. They are underwriting a massive alternative supply chain. ODMs will prioritize these non-NVIDIA rack designs because the CapEx commitment is absolute. This creates a two-tier infrastructure. NVIDIA remains the standard for enterprise and Tier 2 clouds, but the hyperscalers decouple, using their grid dominance to deploy custom silicon where margins and efficiency matter most.
That's a fair read, but let's not lose sight of the physical bottlenecks. Even if Meta and Google gain bargaining power and shift supply chains, their ability to scale still hinges on grid access and cooling, resources that don't multiply just because they have custom chips or UALink. According to EPRI, U.S. data center electricity demand could triple by 2030, outpacing planned grid upgrades. So, while this pact may deepen hyperscaler dominance, it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that whoever controls the substation, not just the chip, controls AI's pace.
Exactly. Both power and tooling define the floor, not ceiling here. EPRI's 3x demand projection by 2030 confirms grid constraints will gate capacity, while my own migration pains prove cross-vendor infra still lacks maturity. PyTorch/XLA and NCCL regressions aren't trivial. They delay actual silicon value realization. Guests write about supply chain leverage, but this pact is less about ending Nvidia's reign and more about hyperscalers hoarding megawatts through unified rack designs. The real post-Nvidia shift happens when software lets us swap accelerators as fluidly as Kubernetes pods, not when power pricing becomes the new moat.
Let me stitch this together and push on the post-Nvidia framing. What you're all describing sounds less like an exit from Nvidia and more like a forked universe. Hyperscalers with custom silicon plus first call on scarce megawatts, and everyone else living in Nvidia-centric, power-constrained world. Synergy's latest numbers put hyperscalers at over 50% of global data center capacity already, so this pact arguably cements that split. The question I want you to tackle next is, does that bifurcation slow overall AI innovation, or does competition at the top eventually trickle down in cheaper, more efficient infrastructure for the rest of the market?
I disagree that innovation slows. This bifurcation actually industrializes the alternative. When hyperscalers commit CapEx to UALink, they're effectively subsidizing the R&D for a non-proprietary supply chain. Just like open compute project designs trickle down, these custom rack architectures will eventually reach Tier 2 clouds via ODMs like Quanta or WeWin. Broadcom is already projecting over $11 billion in custom AI chip revenue this year, signaling that this isn't a niche experiment, it's a maturing ecosystem. We aren't seeing a slowdown, we're seeing the commoditization of the AI backend, which forces Nvidia to compete on TCO, not just moat.
I'd caution against assuming this trickle-down will democratize AI infrastructure anytime soon. Even as hyperscalers invest billions and open up alternative supply chains, the real constraint, grid and cooling access, remains tightly held. Uptime Institute found only 10% of data centers could support racks over 50 kilowatts in 2024, and those are overwhelmingly in hyperscaler campuses. So, unless there's a parallel investment in public grid upgrades and regional power equity, most organizations will still be priced out, regardless of how cheap the chips or ODM racks get.
This bifurcation won't slow top-tier innovation, but it will widen the access gap. With hyperscalers already controlling most high-density campuses, their CapEx will industrialize an open supply chain. Yet unless grid upgrades catch up, more players still can't run the racks. EPR's 2030 demand outlook confirms upgrades lag, and the fact only about 10% of data centers could support 50 kilowatt racks last year shows most sites can't plug in anyway. Competition at the top raises the floor, not the ceiling, for everyone else.
So we've landed on a pretty stark picture. Innovation at the top accelerates, but access gaps harden because only a sliver of sites can even power these racks. Let me flip this to the policy and market side. If EPRI's 3x demand forecast and Uptime's 10% high-density figure hold, do we end up with de facto AI enterprise zones clustered around a few substations and tax districts? And if so, who actually moves the needle? FERC and local utilities, or hyperscalers themselves cutting private grid and nuclear renewables deals, like Microsoft's recent small modular reactor push?